A racist cop sees a black woman in uniform and jumps to the worst conclusion, arresting her in front of everyone. But when the truth about her identity is revealed, it turns the entire situation upside down. What happens next will leave you speechless. It was an unusually quiet morning on a tree-lined suburban street in Raleigh, North Carolina. Sergeant Dana Williams, a 27-year-old Army veteran, was heading home in her neatly pressed uniform after her morning jog. She had paused near a local park to check her phone when she noticed a patrol car idling nearby. The tension in her chest tightened, but she pushed it aside. This wasn't the first time she had felt a pair of suspicious eyes on her. From inside the patrol car, Officer Grant Carter watched Dana through his rearview mirror, his lips curled into a frown. Her uniform didn't register at first glance. His focus was solely on the color of her skin. To him, the army green was irrelevant. Instead, he saw what his bias made him believe, someone who didn't belong. Dana began walking again, her pace steady and deliberate. But the sound of the patrol car creeping closer was unmistakable. She stopped as the cruiser pulled up beside her, and Officer Carter stepped out. "Excuse me, ma'am," he called, his voice edged with a warning. "Can I talk to you for a moment?" Dana's heart raced, but her face remained calm. "Of course, officer. Is there a problem?" Carter's gaze narrowed, studying her like she was a suspect. "What are you doing in this area?" She raised her eyebrows, taken aback by the question. "I live here," she replied evenly, gesturing to the row of houses ahead. "I just finished my jog." "That's funny," Carter said, his tone dripping with disbelief. "Haven't seen you around here before." Dana's jaw tightened, but she maintained her composure. "I've lived here for 3 years. I'm also a sergeant in the United States Army, officer." Her words seemed to bounce off him. Carter's hand hovered near his holster as he said, "Do you have any ID on you?" Dana reached into her pocket slowly, pulling out her military ID and handing it to him. He barely glanced at it before tossing it back to her. "This doesn't prove anything," Carter said coldly. "There's been a lot of car break-ins around here. You fit the description of someone we've been looking for." Dana's mouth went dry. "A soldier in full uniform fits the description?" she asked, her voice sharp now. "Officer, I think there's been a mistake." Carter's eyes narrowed further. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back," he ordered, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. A small crowd began to gather on the sidewalk, their murmurs filling the air. Dana glanced at them, humiliation burning in her chest. "This isn't necessary," she pleaded, but her words were drowned out by the sound of the cuffs clicking shut around her wrists. "Just doing my job," Carter said, his tone void of empathy. As Dana stood there, hands bound, her mind raced. But she wasn't angry for herself. She was angry because this wasn't just about her. It was about every other person of color who had been reduced to a stereotype, their accomplishments ignored, their dignity stripped away. And she knew deep down, this moment wasn't over yet. It was only the beginning. The scene unfolding on the quiet street was charged with unease. Neighbors stood on their porches, phones in hand, recording or murmuring amongst themselves. Some whispered in disbelief, while others simply watched in silence. Officer Carter tightened the cuffs on Dana's wrists, ignoring the visible discomfort in her eyes. His partner, Officer Rachel Stevens, stepped out of the patrol car and approached cautiously. She'd seen Carter act impulsively before, but this situation felt different. Wrong. "Grant," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the mounting tension. "Are you sure this is necessary?" "She's in uniform, for God's sake." Carter shot her a sharp glare. "Don't start with me, Rachel. I know what I'm doing." "You saw the reports about car break-ins in this area, and you think she's your suspect?" Rachel countered, lowering her voice. "We're talking about a soldier here. This doesn't add up." "Stay out of it," Carter snapped, before turning back to Dana, who stood tall despite the humiliation. Her back was straight, her face calm, but her eyes were defiant. "You're making a mistake," Dana said firmly, her voice carrying an authority Carter wasn't used to. "You're profiling me, and I won't let this go unnoticed," Carter scoffed, gesturing toward the patrol car. "We'll see what the station has to say. Let's go." Rachel hesitated as Carter grabbed Dana's arm and began leading her to the vehicle. The murmurs from the onlookers grew louder. One man shouted, "She's clearly in the army. What are you doing?" Another called out, "This is wrong. Leave her alone." But Carter pressed on, determined to assert his authority. Dana climbed into the back seat, her head held high despite the sting of tears she refused to shed. The car door slammed shut behind her, silencing the noise of the crowd. As the cruiser pulled away, Dana's mind raced. Her training as a soldier had prepared her for difficult situations. But this was something else entirely. The uniform she wore, a symbol of her service and sacrifice, had done nothing to shield her from prejudice. She felt an unfamiliar mix of rage and helplessness. But underneath it all, there was a steady resolve. When they arrived at the precinct, Dana was escorted into a small, stark room with nothing but a table and 2 chairs. Carter remained silent as he uncuffed her and gestured for her to sit. She complied, her expression unreadable. "I'll be right back," Carter said gruffly, stepping out of the room and leaving her alone. Outside, Rachel intercepted him, her face pale with anger. "What's your plan here, Carter?" she demanded. "You have no evidence, no probable cause, and a room full of witnesses who know you just detained an innocent woman." "She'll fold," Carter muttered dismissively. "They always do." Rachel's jaw clenched. "They? Do you even hear yourself?" She shook her head. "This isn't policing, Grant. It's harassment." Carter shrugged her off and walked down the hall, leaving Rachel standing there, her fists clenched at her sides. She glanced back at the interrogation room, her chest tightening. She didn't want to be part of this, but her silence would make her complicit. Meanwhile, Dana sat alone, her heart steady, but her anger simmering. She could hear muffled voices through the thin walls, though she couldn't make out the words. She thought about her late father, a Marine who had raised her to believe in fairness and justice. "Never lower your head for anyone," he had always said. "If you stand for truth, they can't break you." The door opened suddenly, and Carter returned with a smug grin on his face. He placed a file on the table and slid into the chair opposite her. "Do you want to come clean now?" he asked, leaning back with an air of arrogance. "Or should we start digging?" Dana blinked at him, unimpressed. "Come clean about what?" she asked coldly. Jogging while black, Carter's expression darkened, but before he could respond, the door swung open again. Rachel entered, holding a stack of papers and her phone. "Carter," she said sharply, "we need to talk." "What now?" he barked. Rachel ignored his tone and handed him the documents. "I called it in. Turns out she's exactly who she says she is. Sergeant Dana Williams, honorably discharged after 6 years of active duty, now serving in the reserves. Oh, and she's a Bronze Star recipient." Carter's face went pale as he scanned the papers. Rachel continued, her voice sharp and unwavering. "You just arrested a decorated soldier in front of an entire neighborhood for absolutely nothing." Dana met Carter's stunned gaze, her expression calm but piercing. "I told you this was a mistake," she said evenly. "Now what are you going to do to fix it?" But as Carter sat there, fumbling for a response, Dana knew the damage was already done. This wasn't about fixing one moment. It was about exposing the rot that allowed it to happen in the first place. The air in the precinct grew heavier as the weight of Rachel's revelation sank in. Carter, still holding the papers with Dana's military record, looked flustered, as if searching for a way to save face. Rachel crossed her arms, her eyes burning with quiet rage. Dana sat still, her hands clasped in front of her on the cold metal table, her calm demeanor now a sharp contrast to the storm brewing in Carter's head. "You've got nothing to say, Officer Carter," Rachel pressed, her voice laced with contempt. "You humiliated her in front of her neighbors, arrested her without cause, and now it turns out she's a war hero." Carter began, but Rachel cut him off. "Save it," she snapped. "Because you're not explaining this to me. You'll be explaining it to the captain." She turned to Dana, her voice softening. "Sergeant Williams, I'm so sorry for what's happened to you. I'll make sure this gets handled appropriately." Before Dana could respond, the door opened, and Captain Lewis entered, his presence immediately commanding the room's attention. He was a tall, imposing man in his mid-50s, with graying hair and a no-nonsense demeanor. His sharp eyes flicked between Carter, Rachel, and Dana, quickly assessing the situation. "I just got an earful from dispatch," he said, his tone stern. "What in the hell is going on here?" Rachel wasted no time. "Captain, Officer Carter wrongfully detained Sergeant Dana Williams without probable cause. She's an Army veteran, and her only crime was existing in a neighborhood he decided she didn't belong in." Lewis's jaw tightened as he looked at Carter, Is this true? Carter stammered. I thought she matched the description from the break-ins. Lewis raised a hand to silence him, his voice sharp. Enough. That's not good enough, Carter. We don't operate on assumptions and prejudice in this department, or at least we shouldn't. Dana finally spoke, her voice steady but firm. Captain, with all due respect, this isn't just about Officer Carter. This is about a pattern, a system that allows people like him to operate unchecked. Today it's me. Tomorrow, it's someone else. Lewis turned to her, his expression softening. You're right, Sergeant Williams, and I assure you, this will be investigated thoroughly. I've heard that before, Dana replied evenly. But words don't erase what happened. They don't erase the humiliation, the fear, or the loss of trust. The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air like a stone. For a moment, Lewis seemed to wrestle with his response. Then he turned to Rachel. Take Sergeant Williams to the lounge and make sure she's comfortable. I'll deal with Carter. Rachel nodded and gestured for Dana to follow her. As they left the interrogation room, Dana caught a glimpse of Carter, his face pale and his shoulders slumped. The satisfaction was fleeting. She didn't want revenge. She wanted accountability. In the lounge, Rachel handed Dana a cup of water. I know this doesn't make up for what happened, she said softly. But I want you to know I'm on your side. Carter's behavior is inexcusable. Dana sipped the water, her gaze fixed ahead. It's not just Carter, she said after a moment. It's the system that allows him to think he can get away with this. Rachel nodded, a flicker of guilt crossing her face. You're right. And I've been part of that system. I've let things slide because I was scared to speak up. But I'm done staying silent. Dana studied her for a moment before offering a small nod. It starts with people like you deciding enough is enough. Meanwhile, back in the captain's office, Carter sat rigid in his chair, his eyes locked on the desk as Lewis loomed over him. You've embarrassed this department, Lewis said, his voice like thunder. But worse than that, you've violated the trust of the very people we're supposed to protect. Captain, Carter began, but Lewis cut him off. Don't. You've shown me exactly who you are today, and there's no place for that in my department. You're suspended pending an internal review. Hand in your badge and gun. Carter's face fell. He opened his mouth to argue, but the look in Lewis's eyes stopped him. With trembling hands, he unfastened his badge and placed it on the desk. This isn't over, Lewis said. And you'd better start thinking about your future, because it won't be here. Later that afternoon, Dana sat in the captain's office. Lewis leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk. Sergeant Williams, I want you to know that I take this seriously. Officer Carter will face disciplinary action, and will be implementing mandatory bias training across the department. Dana met his gaze, her expression calm but resolute. Captain, training is a start, but it's not enough. You need to change the culture. That's a long fight, and it takes more than one bad apple being dealt with. It takes real accountability, real consequences, and a commitment to doing better. Lewis nodded, a flicker of respect crossing his face. You're right. And I'll do everything in my power to make sure this department earns back the trust it's lost. You have my word. Dana stood, her posture as strong as ever. We'll see if your actions match your words, Captain. Because this isn't just about me. It's about all the people who don't have a uniform to defend them. As she left the precinct, the weight of the day's events settled on her shoulders, but beneath the exhaustion was a glimmer of hope. She had spoken her truth, and for once, it felt like someone was listening. Dana stepped outside the precinct, into the late afternoon sun. The crowd that had gathered earlier was gone, replaced by the quiet hum of traffic and the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. But Dana knew the day's events were far from over. Her story wasn't just hers anymore. It had already started to spread. Across the street, a young woman approached hesitantly, holding her phone in one hand and clutching a small notepad in the other. "Excuse me, Sergeant Williams?" she asked, her voice careful but eager. "I'm Zoe Martin, a reporter with the Raleigh-Times. Would you be willing to talk about what happened today?" Dana hesitated, weighing her options. Speaking out could shine a light on the injustice she'd faced, but it could also bring unwanted attention. After a moment, she met Zoe's gaze. "I'll talk," she said, her voice steady. "But this isn't just about me. It's about the bigger picture. That evening, the story broke online. The headline was impossible to miss. Decorated black soldier wrongfully arrested by racist cop, a systemic issue exposed. The accompanying video, captured by a neighbor, showed Dana standing in her military uniform, handcuffed, while Officer Carter ignored her protests. It spread like wildfire, shared across social media platforms, and igniting outrage in the comments. "Shameful," one commenter wrote. "How many times does this have to happen before real change comes? This woman served her country, and this is how she's treated," another said. "We need accountability now." By the next morning, Dana's name was trending. Messages of support poured in from around the country. Veterans, activists, and everyday people expressing their solidarity. But not all the responses were positive. The usual chorus of denial and deflection reared its head, with some claiming the video didn't show the full story. Dana refused to let it faze her. Instead, she focused on what she could do with the platform she had suddenly been given. She began responding to messages, connecting with organizations that fought for police accountability, and agreeing to interviews to share her experience. Meanwhile, the ripple effects were felt within the Raleigh Police Department. Captain Lewis called an emergency meeting with his officers, addressing the controversy head-on. He stood before them, his tone firm but measured. "This department is under scrutiny," he began. "And let's be clear, that scrutiny is well-deserved. The incident involving Sergeant Williams has shown us that we have serious work to do. If you're not willing to be part of the solution, you need to ask yourself why you're here." The room was silent, save for the occasional shuffle of uneasy officers. Rachel Stevens sat near the front, her jaw set in determination. She had spent the night reflecting on her own role in the department, and decided she wouldn't remain silent anymore. When Lewis opened the floor for questions, her hand shot up. "Captain, I think we need more than just bias training," Rachel said, her voice steady but passionate. "We need a complete overhaul of how we approach accountability. That starts with listening to the people we're supposed to serve." Lewis nodded, his expression unreadable. "You're absolutely right, Officer Stevens, and I'm counting on voices like yours to push us forward." For Carter, the fallout was swift and unrelenting. The internal review revealed not just his mishandling of Dana's case, but a history of complaints that had been ignored or quietly dismissed. The department released a public statement announcing his termination. But for Dana, it felt like the bare minimum. Days later, Dana found herself sitting in a local cafe, her phone buzzing with notifications. Across the table sat Zoe Martin, her notepad open and a recorder running. "How are you handling all the attention?" Zoe asked. Dana shrugged, her expression thoughtful. "It's overwhelming, but it's necessary. If my story can spark change, then it's worth it." Zoe nodded, leaning forward. "What do you hope comes out of all this?" Dana paused, her gaze distant for a moment. "I hope people see that this isn't just about one bad cop or one bad incident. It's about a system that allows these things to happen over and over again. I want accountability. I want people to stop looking the other way. And I want others to know they're not alone." Her words carried a quiet conviction, one that Zoe knew would resonate with readers. As the interview wrapped up, Zoe promised to use her platform to amplify Dana's voice. That night, Dana sat at her kitchen table, scrolling through the messages she'd received. One stood out, a heartfelt letter from a young black girl who had seen the video. "Dear Sergeant Williams," it began. "I saw what happened to you, and it made me sad and angry. But it also made me proud because you didn't let them break you. I want to be brave like you someday." Dana's throat tightened as she read the letter again. It was a reminder of why she was doing this. Not for revenge, but for those who looked to her as a symbol of strength. Her resolve hardened. This was only the beginning of her fight, and she was ready to see it through. 2 weeks after her wrongful arrest, Dana stood at the podium of a packed community center. The room buzzed with energy. Local activists, veterans, students, and concerned citizens had all come to hear her speak. Behind her, a banner read, "Justice through action, the fight for accountability." Dana adjusted the microphone, her eyes scanning the crowd. She felt the weight of their expectations, but more importantly, she felt their support. "Good evening, everyone," she began, her voice steady. 2 weeks ago, I stood in handcuffs on a quiet street, treated like a criminal for the simple act of existing in my own neighborhood. That experience was painful, but it wasn't unique, and that's why we're here tonight. Because what happened to me happens every day to people without the platform to fight back. The audience erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the hall. Dana continued, her tone growing stronger. This isn't just about me. It's about challenging a system that allows racial profiling, abuse of power, and unchecked prejudice to persist. It's about demanding real change. Not tomorrow, not someday, but now. She paused, letting the room settle. And change doesn't come from one person. It comes from all of us. Together we can hold those in power accountable. Together we can create a future where no one has to feel unsafe because of the color of their skin. The crowd rose to their feet, their applause deafening. Dana stepped back, letting the moment wash over her. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of hope, not just for herself, but for everyone fighting the same battle. As the event wrapped up, people lingered to talk to Dana, offering words of gratitude and solidarity. A young man approached her, his hands trembling slightly as he extended a flyer. "I started this group after I saw your story," he said, his voice tinged with nervous excitement. "We're organizing to push for a civilian oversight board for the police. We'd love your support." Dana took the flyer, reading the bold print. "Accountability now, a community-driven approach to policing." She smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "You already have my support," she said, shaking his hand. "Let me know how I can help." Meanwhile, across town, the fallout from Dana's arrest continued to ripple through the Raleigh Police Department. Under immense public pressure, Captain Lewis announced a series of sweeping reforms, including mandatory bias training, improved oversight of officer conduct, and an anonymous reporting system for officers to call out misconduct without fear of retaliation. Rachel Stevens, who had become one of the most vocal advocates for reform within the department, was tapped to lead a task force focused on improving community relations. "We have a lot of work to do," she said in a press conference, "but we're committed to rebuilding trust. One step at a time." Back at home, Dana sat on her couch, scrolling through an email inbox, overflowing with messages. Amid the flood of invitations, speaking requests, and letters of support, one message stood out. It was from a high-ranking official in the Department of Defense, who had seen her story and wanted to invite her to speak at a national conference on leadership and diversity in the military. As she read the email, Dana felt a mix of emotions: pride, gratitude, and a renewed sense of purpose. Her journey wasn't just about exposing injustice anymore. It was about using her voice to create a ripple effect that reached far beyond her own experience. Weeks turned into months, and Dana's story became a catalyst for change on a national scale. News outlets continued to cover her fight, highlighting her collaboration with advocacy groups and her push for legislative reforms. A petition she started, calling for mandatory body cameras and stricter consequences for racial profiling, gained over 500,000 signatures in just a month. Her work also inspired others to speak out. Stories poured in from across the country, people sharing their own encounters with injustice, finding courage in her example. Dana responded to as many as she could, often staying up late into the night to offer encouragement and advice. One day, Dana received a phone call from Zoe Martin, the reporter who had first covered her story. "I wanted to let you know," Zoe said, her voice warm with excitement. "Your story has been nominated for a National Journalism Award. It's had a huge impact." Dana smiled, her mind drifting back to the day of her arrest. What had started as a moment of humiliation and injustice had transformed into something so much bigger, a movement that was challenging people to confront uncomfortable truths and demand a better future. On the one-year anniversary of her arrest, Dana returned to the same street where it all began. This time she wasn't alone. A crowd of supporters, including neighbors, activists, and even some of the officers who had embraced reform, stood with her. The same young girl who had written Dana a letter was there too, holding a handmade sign that read, "Thank you, Sergeant Williams." As Dana looked out at the crowd, her heart swelled. She raised the microphone to her lips, her voice steady and strong. "This isn't the end," she said. "It's the beginning. Change is possible, and it starts with each of us deciding that enough is enough." Together, we can create a world where dignity, respect, and justice aren't privileges, they're rights. The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices carrying a shared hope. For Dana, it was a moment of triumph, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been silenced, ignored, or dismissed. The fight wasn't over, but she was ready for whatever came next. In the distance, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the street in a warm, golden glow. It was a new day, not just for Dana, but for everyone who believed in the power of justice to light the way forward.